The war had already stolen names, faces, and futures long before Elena realized it had stolen her childhood, too. Because when the sirens wailed across the ruined border, town and soldiers flooded the streets like a tide of iron boots and rifles. She did not cry or scream or run. She stood frozen, clutching the medical satchel against her chest, knowing that neutrality was a lie, told to the weak, and that every human being standing between two flags eventually became a target. And Elena had learned that lesson the day her father was dragged from their home for treating wounded men without asking which side they fought for, the day his glasses shattered on the cobblestone and his blood soaked into the cracks of the street while officers shouted that mercy was treason. And now, years later, she served as a field medic, not because she believed in any banner, but because pain sounded the same in every language, and blood never cared about uniforms. And on that gray morning when the fog rolled low over the abandoned railway station, she did not know that destiny was stalking her from the other side of the battlefield, wearing the colors she had been taught to fear most. Because across the torn earth and barbed wire lay a man named Thomas Hale, a sniper whose hands had learned how to end lives before they ever learned how to hold them gently, a man raised on stories of honor and enemies and victory, who now lay prone in the rubble with his rifle trained toward the station where Elena knelt beside a wounded boy, and through the scope he saw her hair pulled tight beneath a scarf, her hands steady as she pressed cloth against bleeding flesh, and something inside him faltered, because he had been told medics were shields for spies and liars. Yet the woman in his sights moved, with the quiet urgency of someone who had buried too many already, and as explosions echoed and bullets snapped through the air, orders crackled through Thomas's earpiece telling him to eliminate anyone aiding the opposing forces. But his finger hesitated on the trigger, his breath shallow, because he saw not an enemy, but a woman whispering comfort to a dying child, while the world burned around them. And when the boy's chest stilled and Elena bowed her head for a heartbeat of silence, before forcing herself upright again, Thomas felt something fracture inside him that no training could repair. Because war taught men how to survive, not how to live with what survival cost. And when chaos erupted again and enemy troops surged forward, Elena was suddenly exposed, caught between collapsing walls and crossfire, and Thomas watched as a rifleman from his own unit took aim at her back. And in that moment, instinct overpowered allegiance. And Thomas fired, not at her, but at the man about to kill her, and the shot echoed louder than any command he had ever followed, because it was the sound of a soldier choosing conscience over country. And before he could process what he had done, return fire ripped through the rubble, and Thomas felt the impact slam into his shoulder, spinning him hard into the dirt, pain blooming hot and blinding. While Elena turned at the sound and saw him fall, a stranger in enemy colors bleeding out because of her, and something older than fear surged through her veins, because she had sworn once, over her father's grave, that she would never again watch a man die when her hands could stop it. And so she ran across open ground, through bullets and screams, toward the man who had just saved her life without ever knowing her name. And when she reached him and tore open his jacket, she saw the wound deep and ragged, blood pouring through her fingers as his eyes fluttered open in shock. And for a split second they stared at one another, enemy and enemy, savior and saved, before the world narrowed to survival. And Elena worked with ruthless focus, binding the wound, injecting what little morphine she had left, ignoring the shouts of soldiers drawing closer, because war did not scare her half as much as the thought of becoming the kind of person who turned away. And when Thomas whispered hoarsely that she should leave him, that his side would kill her if they found her there, she shook her head and said the words that would bind their fates forever. "I don't leave people behind." And as she dragged him into the shadows of a collapsed wall while the battle thundered on, neither of them knew that this single act of mercy would ignite consequences far greater than any bullet fired that day. And if this story already has your heart racing, remember to subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will change everything they believed about loyalty, love, and the true cost of war. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness as Elena moved him through back alleys and shattered courtyards. Under cover of night, each step a gamble, each breath a fragile victory, because every patrol they avoided, and every checkpoint they slipped past felt like fate itself, holding its breath. And when they finally reached the abandoned monastery that Elena used as a hidden triage station, the walls scorched and sacred icons cracked by artillery, she laid him on a makeshift cot and worked through the night, stitching muscle and skin by lantern light while rain tapped softly against the broken roof. And Thomas watched her with a mixture of pain and disbelief, because he had been raised to believe that the enemy was faceless, cruel, undeserving of mercy. Yet here was a woman who should have hated him kneeling over his body as if his life mattered. And when fever took him and he raved of battles and orders and the men he had lost, Elena stayed wiping his brow, anchoring him back to the present with gentle words, because she knew trauma when she heard it, and she knew that soldiers carried ghosts heavier than their rifles. And days passed in tense silence as the war shifted around them, news drifting in of advancing lines and retaliations. And when Thomas finally regained his strength enough to sit up, the weight of what he had done settled heavily on his chest, because returning to his unit would mean execution for treason, and staying would endanger Elena. And he told her as much, expecting fear or anger, but she simply nodded and said she had been living under threat since the day the war began, and something unspoken passed between them in that moment. A recognition that both had already lost too much to pretend safety still existed, and as they talked through long nights, sharing stories in hushed voices, Thomas spoke of the boyhood dreams that had died in the trenches, and Elena spoke of her father and the oath she carried like a scar. And slowly, painfully, connection grew, not born of romance at first, but of understanding, of two souls who had seen the worst humanity could offer and still chose kindness. And when soldiers eventually found the monastery, guns raised and suspicion sharp, Thomas stepped forward despite his injury, hands raised, placing himself between Elena and the firing line, confessing his betrayal, declaring that if a crime had been committed, it was his alone. And as weapons cocked and tension snapped tight, Elena spoke too, her voice steady as she demanded they remember they were human before they were uniforms. And perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps the war had finally burned out whatever cruelty remained in those men. But the shots never came, and instead they left, warning that mercy was rare and would not come again. And in the aftermath, as dawn broke through shattered stained glass, Thomas and Elena stood amid the wreckage knowing they could never go back to who they were, only forward into something uncertain and dangerous and real. And when the war finally ended months later, not with victory but with silence and graves, they left the borderlands together, carrying scars both visible and hidden, building a life far from flags and gunfire, where the story of a bullet meant to kill instead saved two souls, and where love grew not because the world was kind, but because they chose to be. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that humanity can survive even in the darkest times, then subscribe to this channel, because every story we tell is a reminder that courage is not found in pulling the trigger, but in knowing when not to.